So good morning. I've never been asked for walk-on music before, and when I got the email to say what walk-on music did I want, and by the time I saw the email, they said it's too late, we're choosing it for you. So that's what we have. But I'm now going to have walk-on music always. I think this is actually a good thing. I'm really grateful to have been invited to speak with you. There's a little bait and switch going on because what Doro asked me a few months ago was to be on a panel and say a few things basically in response to some really smart people. 48 hours ago she wrote and she said, would you mind doing the first session for about 20 minutes on your own? And so I said yes, and then I very mindfully lost my laptop, which I've since found. And so what I was going to say is somewhere in upstate New York right now. But we'll bring it here, which is, I've got a few notes. I don't know that I'm a great choice for the first speaker of this series, and so I'm sorry, but it's going to get better throughout the rest of the day. You know, I'm not an oncologist. I don't have a lot of experience in regenerative medicine. I'm not a yoga teacher. I'm definitely not a fitness teacher, so all of which you're going to, and I'm not a nutritionist, all of which you're going to experience later on. I also, how do I say, I don't actually believe in the title of my talk. Which is, I'm sorry. So, and I'm not looking at Doro and Tricia because I'm sure they're staring at me now. What it means to live a balanced life. And I thought about that a lot, and my response is not much. I think that balance in a lot of ways is artificial and a little bit boring, quite frankly. I was never a big fan of Little Red Riding Hood when I was a kid, and I hated reading it to my own kids, because every time I got to the kind of not too hot, not too cold piece, or the not too hard, not too soft piece, I thought, what's the fun in that, first of all? And secondly, it's not our life experience, or at least not my life experience. If you dissect a life, if you look back at any point in your life, I think that it is primarily a life which is lived with moments that are high and moments that are low, of actions and reactions, basically a lot of opposites that are competing for attention in various ways. So good and bad, being happy, being sad, being productive, being lazy, and we'll come back to that in a minute in terms of the mindfulness movement. Me and you is where a whole lot of trouble happens in terms of the experience of that particular dichotomy. Now, on a relative level, I think that opposites can be useful. It's useful to have a red light and a green light at an intersection. It's useful generally to have caffeine or decaf. In this particular case, with the folks that I'm meeting here, we should probably lean more to the decaf, but in any case, it's a kind of thing that's just a practical way for us to live a life. But from a deeper perspective, I think that there's more than just this sort of set of competing opposites that we experience as the sort of normal, what we think is a normal existence. And if you look at it, and I'm a Buddhist practitioner. I became a Buddhist when I was 19 years old, so it's a long time ago, and have had a practice for 47 years. There is nothing exclusive to the mindfulness and contemplative movement that suggests that you have to be a Buddhist in any way. And I know that Jon Kabat-Zinn, who I've known for a long time, speaks about that eloquently. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But in the sort of practice that I've embarked on, we take a look a lot at how we live our lives with a lens of hope and fear as being the sort of primary way that we kind of walk through our day, walk through our lives. And that, probably if you think about it, you've all experienced it. It's all actually a very comfortable friend that you carry around, these qualities of hope and fear. We like the notion to pretend that we can freeze or hold on to pleasurable moments in our lives, whatever those might be, satisfaction at work, happiness at home, whatever it is, we'd like to hold on to it. And aren't we shocked that that doesn't work? That We have the hope, but it doesn't last. And at the same time, on the fear side, as we're experiencing challenges and pain and difficulty, a lot of effort is put into the sort of pushing away. And from moment to moment, the pushing away might feel like it's real and might feel like it works, but the reality is that it's whatever the discomfort we're experiencing is going to get replaced by something else, equally discomfort later, and you can kind of count on that. I mean, there's very little way to suggest that that won't be what happens in our lives. And so maybe this is where I go back to the little bit of concern about the notion of balance, is that over a lot of years of talking about meditation and contemplative practice with lots and lots of people, I always am concerned that there's this temptation to want to use these practices to take the edge off. And that what we're doing here is trying to kind of blunt the sharp edges of hope and of fear, of pain and of pleasure, and basically by coming to some kind of flattened state, somehow that's a little less exhausting in terms of how we live our lives. That's a kind of pharmaceutical approach to mindfulness or meditation that I'm not a big fan of. I think that in the face of very extreme states of mind, there's actually value in kind of dialing down to some extent, but I think we have to be very careful about where that line is drawn. And the idea of balance to me doesn't work if what balance means is basically gray, compromise, basically soft, any of those kinds of qualities. The value of mindfulness meditation, as was described this morning, I think in part is an opportunity to look deeply at the root cause of this sort of hope and fear that arises from all of us, and to do that in a way to become basically first familiar with it. Now, it's 2017, so there's an app for that. There's also less technologically sophisticated ways to approach this work as well, and it goes back for thousands of years, not just in Asia, and again, we shouldn't be tying mindfulness meditation or contemplation with something that has sort of emerged from Asia. It actually has emerged from humans and human condition and a human desire to find some kind of deeper understanding of who we are as people. The tool exists, and the tool is basically one which allows us to lean into those edges that I talked about before rather than blunt them or soften them. And there are a lot of flavors to mindfulness. So, as I was saying, it's not religious, but it can be, and neither are a problem. It's not secular science, but it can be, and there's some discussion about that. I will point you to a Scientific American article that just came out 2 days ago, challenging the efficacy of mindfulness altogether, and is actually, I think, a good thing. I mean, I'm a mindfulness practitioner, and at first I thought I'm insulted. And then when you actually read it, I think that we're in a space where, at least in the West, we've been working with these ideas of contemplative practice and mindfulness for 4 decades, maybe, as a society, probably less than that. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with researchers or academics or journals poking holes in a lot of the assumptions that we make. I think it's then up to us to figure out what we do with that critique. But in any case, it can be science, it doesn't have to be science. A lot of meditation is viewed as something which has come from Asia, but the fact is it also comes from cathedrals, it also comes from storefront churches in downtown urban centers. The key is whether or not what's being presented in terms of looking at our own minds and our own states of being is honest and genuine, or whether or not it's coercive. That's a big risk, I think, that we all take, and to be a little more serious for a second, I think it really is important for anybody that embarks on a path of mindfulness or contemplation as part of an overall journey toward greater health and wellness, it's really important to have a very skeptical view of anything that you're being presented. You can't be overly cynical because there's a lot of wisdom out there, and there are a lot of people that have important tools and important ways to guide us through the journey, but there needs to constantly be a questioning of all of the assumptions. And if something feels off, it's a great opportunity to deepen the practice and actually kind of work on why it feels off. And you know what? You actually could be right. So it isn't just a question of meditate more and you'll understand why I'm right, but a question of meditate more and find out what is the discomfort, where is it coming from? Is it coming from some self-delusion, or is it coming from something real? There could be, there are charlatans out there. I'm the president of a university. We're accredited by a national accrediting body. It's stressful. I don't think they ever make any sense. I'm not suggesting that we're looking for an accreditation mindfulness body in that way, but I do think that we each hold a certain responsibility to maintain the integrity of the work we're doing together, and I'd invite you to consider what your role is there. Key to mindfulness practice from my perspective is not merely the sort of being present part, because the being present part is actually hard. As was described earlier, there's a constant kind of distraction arising and falling. And so to really have an effective practice, to have an effective way of bringing our mind truly to the present, starts with becoming kind to oneself. Being kind to ourselves means not being judgmental, of not feeling bad because we're distracted, and at the same time not feeling overly proud of the fact that we're not distracted, because frankly it's not probably true. We're probably distracted in any case. But a basic sense of kind of kindness, which I think is a very important thing for us to look at as practitioners, which is very internal at the beginning. You know, many of the practices talk about settling the body, settling the mind, finding a synchronization between the sort of somatic experience, the physical experience, and the mental experience, the kind of calming of the mind, creating the conditions where we can look more deeply. That actually takes a willingness to be nice to ourselves as practitioners, because otherwise we get very frustrated very quickly and all the time, and that actually is not all that helpful. It's also pretty funny to practice mindfulness or meditation, and I find the more I practice, the funnier it feels in a lot of ways, that we are doing something which appears in some sense to be pretty artificial. You know, so you have your meditation cushion, you have your meditation room, you have a particular meditation music, you have your meditation gong, or you have an app I have a couple apps for the gongs. There's a kind of an artificial construct which, if you step back and look, you say, you know, that was not me 20 years ago, right? I did not imagine that I was going to be that person. It certainly wasn't me when I first started meditating. I was very involved in civil rights politics and you know, doing things that were kind of out there in the world in a pretty aggressive way, at least as I was experiencing it. I did not have my own visualization of sitting on a meditation cushion for an hour doing this practice. But the reality is, I found it to be a very helpful way to bring that into my life. I guess I'll go back to my balance concern. The reality is that this mindfulness or meditation practice can happen at any moment and at any point. It doesn't need any artificial construct surrounding it. So it is very cool to go for a walk in the woods and to notice the trees and to notice the flowers and to notice the mosquitoes and to notice the barking dog that's running after you and all of those things. It's also very cool in the middle of an intense situation at work to not stop, because it's hard to get up and say, sorry, now I have to go and be mindful, I'll come back to this. But to notice internally that opportunity for a very quick kind of momentary flash back to the sort of basic ground of this is hope, this is fear, this is what's arising. It's multitasking to the extreme, so it's a good thing in this case, multitasking. I frequently talk about it as being overly distracting, but in the case of kind of giving rise to the insights that come from finding yourself wandering and coming back and not basically announcing to the world that that's what you're doing, because it would be very weird and kind of seen as an odd thing to the people around you. It's actually a very powerful kind of practice. Again, coming from a certain kind of kindness. I don't want to be the person that I feel is arising in some way. I want to be something else. I don't know what that something else is, and that's up to you, but there's a sense of discontent, and you want to move into a kind of place of being a bit more content in what you're doing. And to the earlier point, and Doro and Trish and I did not compare notes, so I have a muscle analogy as well, but there is a kind of value to an ongoing practice of self-kindness. The interesting thing about that is that in order to be a compassionate and kind and effective person to others, it's absolutely essential from my perspective to have exercised and have developed the sort of personal compassion, the sort of self-kindness that comes from having a deliberate practice. My Buddhist teacher, who was a Tibetan teacher, said early on that the sign of genuine compassion, of being a genuinely compassionate person, is if you're completely uncertain as to whether or not what you're doing in any given time is being generous or compassionate to yourself or generous or compassionate to other. And that you've dropped the kind of I and other because compassion becomes the environmental condition as opposed to it's me being nice to you or me being nice to myself and screw it if it's not being nice to you. Whatever the point is, it becomes part of the environment, which is quite powerful. No direction, and back to what I said earlier about some of these opposites, no real sense of me and you as being the important definer of our lives. Because I was coming to Washington on the train, I read an article from a foundation that I'm trying to get money from, so I thought I should read their article so I can talk intelligently about it. And they're writing about the problem with democracy at this point, and I am not going to get into a whole lot of that. But what they were saying was that basically, we're living in this society with great anxiety, great anger, great prejudice, great. Everything is really great, and put all the bad words next to it, and that somehow, as a social matter or political matter, we need to do something about that. Now, I don't disagree with that, but I was somewhere between Wilmington and Baltimore that I had this aha moment on the train, and I said, if everybody read this not from the perspective of it being a political treatise, but being a kind of description of who we are as individuals and individual human beings, this would actually make a lot of sense to me. Because what is this manifestation of aggression and of prejudice and of anger with each other out there if it's not arising from in here? And so I now have something cool to say to this funder when I talk, because they're also interested in spirituality, so I've kind of now put this all together. Which is great, but it is this point of how do we start? Starting with ourselves is critical. That said, while I think that there's value, and I have dear friends who have spent a lot of time over the years in solitary retreats and in directed retreats, and I have a lot of respect for that, and I've done that myself, this is not a sequential body of work. We need to do this inner work and do this inner practice from my perspective as people in 21st century, let's say America now, because that's where we are, while at the same time being concerned about issues that are in front of us, issues of social justice, issues of bias, issues of exclusion, all of those kinds of things. We have to figure out a way to kind of bring those together. Now, I would suggest that coming at those problems from a perspective of personal understanding is a powerful thing, but I don't think that we can kind of leave it out. I noticed in the program that there's a quote from Dr. King. There's one that I've been using a lot at Naropa University, which is where I teach, which has to do with the fierce urgency of now. So in a way, that's a very meditative statement, and it's because, one, it's now, so now is cool, right? Everybody knows that, that's meditative. Urgent is also cool because there's actually, from a Buddhist perspective, one is kind of taught to live your life because death comes without warning. And so you live your life because you could die now. Everybody okay? Everybody sorry. And fierce, which is seemingly to a lot of people maybe not such a meditative expression, is actually very much a mindful or meditative or contemplative or compassionate expression, because it's actually, fierce is referring, from my perspective, my understanding of what I took from Dr. King's statement, it has to do with honesty and directness and no self-deception. And so I think that, you know, especially working with younger people in a university setting where I take seriously the responsibility to create the conditions for students who are going to be leaders 1, 2, and 3 generations out, I think that bringing together the fact that we are human beings living in community with a real need to show kindness and compassion to each other, but that doing that, and we do it at Naropa University, we're a liberal arts college, with very traditional undergraduate and graduate degree programs, but every class has built into the syllabus some kind of contemplative or mindful piece to it. And the manifestations are very different. What's taught in the environmental studies department is completely different from the performance, theater performing department, and so the faculty have great freedom to figure out what they're bringing in terms of self-awareness and contemplative and mindful practice, but it needs to be there somewhere. And our view is, and it's an experiment, we're 47 years old, so this is a young school, but our view is that by allowing a student to explore their own journey from the perspective of both sort of personal transformation and how they express themselves to the world with the real tools that a liberal arts college, I would suggest, offer, is really powerful. And so it'll be probably long after I'm gone, probably physically gone from 50 or 100 years from now, that someone will look back and see whether or not this was an experiment that made any sense. My teacher, the Tibetan teacher that I talked about when he founded Naropa, talked about it as a 500-year experiment. So he's made it really clear none of us would be around to actually know whether it worked or not. And that was actually really good, personally. Well, if you're a Buddhist, you might be a couple lifetimes back. You might be back, but setting aside reincarnation, we probably will not be here to watch it. So anyway, as I started, not the best opening speaker from that point of view, because on the other hand, if what we're looking at in kind of investigating mindfulness and contemplation and compassion provides a different framework, perhaps, even for a couple of hours, changes your ears, changes your way of hearing, allows some degree of focus, that may be an interesting way to hear the wisdom that's going to come from the series of speakers that are going to follow me. So I would just say, if you can sit here, and I know they're going to be, I was just at a mindfulness conference on Monday in New York City, and mindfulness conference, and they lamented that they didn't build in any breaks in 9 hours, which I thought, was not such a hard thing to do. In any case, that's not the case here. So taking advantage of the fact that our friends at BB&R built a program which actually reflects our own state of being, a need to move, a need to be quiet, a need to talk, a need to be anything you want. Approach from that point of view, listen to the other speakers from the perspective of being curious, of being kind. So some people, I mean, we had a dinner last night. I didn't understand half of what some people were talking about. It sounded really good, but I had no idea. And so for a brief moment, I felt like, how dumb am I? And then I realized that, I'm not a nutritionist, and that's the way it is. And so listening to somebody talk about fatty liver disease, I mean, how much, you don't want me to treat your fatty liver disease. So, I mean, there's a limit to what I needed to know. But the fact is that come at it from a point of view of curiosity, a point of view of being kind to yourself in terms of what you know and what you don't know and how it feels. And from my perspective, and I have no idea what other people are going to talk about yet, find the humor in everything that everybody from now until 5 o'clock is going to say, because I guarantee it'll be there. Maybe laugh out loud humor, maybe not, but I think that it's really important to kind of hear this notion of optimal health and achieving optimal health and not take ourselves too seriously as we're sort of moving in that direction. So I appreciate the opportunity to make some opening remarks and look forward to the rest of the day. Thanks.